Hello and welcome, everybody. My name's Jack Chapman. I'm the SVP of Threat Intelligence here at KnowBe4, and I'm really pleased to be able to take you through our sort of a bit of a preview, a bit of a sneak peek into our latest Phishing Trends Report. It's really sort of having a deep dive, evaluating what are the threats, how are sort of the attackers evolving, and what do you need to know both on the defensive side to help protect your organization, but also start to have a bit of a look outwards, look towards 2026 and what techniques attackers are creating and starting to innovate with. So we've got quite an action-packed session, really. Without further ado, I'd like to start off by just talking through some top-level phishing stats, because before we did sort of have a deep dive into a couple of these attack vectors the criminals are organized, I think it's worthwhile taking a step back. So to start with, over the last year, we've seen quite a little bit of an increase in sort of the attack volume that we're seeing from phishing attacks that are getting through. And first and foremost, we've seen a 14% increase in just attack volume. However, this number is slightly misleading, because despite seeing sort of an iterative increase in attack volume, quite similar to previous years, what we have seen is quite a jump up in the sophistication of the attacks. Whenever we sort of evaluate the email threat landscape, we often view it from the point of view of what's the volume of attacks, but also, on average, how sophisticated are they? How likely are they to be successful? Are there multiple layered technological exploits in there, for example? So despite seeing an increase in the attacks, we've actually seen a non-proportional increase in the sophistication. And this is shown by some of the other metrics we track. So another really interesting metric which reinforces this is, for the first time, we see that over half of phishing attacks are being sent from compromised accounts. And just to double click on this slightly, when we talk about compromised accounts, not all attacks coming from compromised accounts are made equally for attacks against your organizations. On sort of the less sophisticated side, but the more commodity, more bulk market point of view, you've got the attacks where criminals have compromised any business account and they're just using that to then attack organizations. So there's no familiarity, there's no knowledge between the attacker and the recipient. They've essentially claimed a compromised account as an asset, and they're using that to essentially pass all the email authentication like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Their account's not been flagged as anything negative or malicious, and it's trusted, it's aged, and all of the other sort of traditional security safeguards which attackers are bypassing by using compromised accounts. However, where we are seeing a shift here is going into some of the more sophisticated uses of compromised accounts. And that's where using compromised accounts in organizations' supply chains. So attackers will compromise an account and then target people in that user's recent history, for example. And the step beyond this, where we're seeing in full supply chain compromises, attackers on the very much sophisticated end of the wedge, targeting organizations surrounding their end target in order to gain access to a supplier to then purposefully target the end target. So quite a lot to unpack there, but it's just to keep that number in mind. Over half of all attacks now coming from compromised accounts. So if you are using any safeguardings around sort of the authentication, that methodology is weakening. We are seeing a continued increase in AI, another 5% increase. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail because the usage of AI continues to increase, but what they're doing with it, and again, the sophistication is changing more. And really, all of this comes out to, we're seeing 44% increase in attacks bypassing secure email gateways, bypassing platform security versus this time last year, which is a huge increase in successful attacks, especially in comparison to a much minor increase in attack volume. So quite a lot to unpack there, but what I'd like to do, just to give you a bit of a sneak preview of more what's in the report and really take you through really what matters. Like, if you don't take anything else away from the threat landscape, here are a couple of things about what's getting through your perimeter. first and foremost, I'd like to talk a bit about polymorphic attacks. And for those who aren't aware, a polymorphic attack is essentially an attack where each email has a slight different change. So in context of a polymorphic attack in the phishing world, it could be I'll send out 10 different phishing emails, and each of them will have a different subject line. It will be from a different source. It could have a different payload, a different link, a different attachment. And just as an example, we can see that this actually applies across the board. So an area that's changed in the polymorphic phishing is historically they've limited it to things like the subject line or the alias name of who the email is claiming to be from. However, we're now seeing quite large sort of generations of changes in body text. So the actual text in the email itself is being changed through sort of AI purposes in order to make each email unique. You might be saying sort of, why are attackers using this technique so much? And it comes down to being very successful at defeating traditional security solutions, because a lot of traditional security is built on block lists and hash-based protection. By changing different elements of their email, we're essentially saying each email is unique. The number of emails in a campaign or in a similar grouping is gone. So that's why attackers are using these techniques. And the key thing to be aware of here is the diversity of techniques within it. The fact that an attacker is changing every single element of the email now, everything from who it's coming from, the payloads themselves, but also largely the bodies of the email. So really key thing to keep in mind. The second key tactic we're seeing that's leading to sort of a good success for criminals is obfuscation, including HTML smuggling. And what I mean by this is where attackers are essentially targeting the technical layer of your security and the AIs that are protecting it. They're actually targeting AIs themselves. A prime example of this is HTML smuggling. And as you can see on your screen, when sort of clicking into what's happening in the payload of this email, we see a lot of text and a lot of obfuscation with sort of just random names, a lot of comments, a lot of unneeded elements, when really the actual payload itself is 4 lines. We're seeing these obfuscations in both the payloads, but it's also incredibly common in the bodies of email as well. The most common example of this is attackers using white space attacks, where they insert 0-sized font in between every word or every letter of a phishing email. So from a human's point of view, it looks very legitimate, but from a computer's point of view, this isn't English. What's going on here? Like, there's no malicious things for me to scan as a computer. And it's a key thing to keep in mind. The last thing that's worth calling out in terms of some of these obfuscation attacks is the continued use of mobile-focused attacks as well, where attackers will customize and tailor their attacks to essentially render the best on mobile devices. And we're seeing these attacks, especially on those out-of-hours attacks, being purpose-built to essentially render best on mobile as well. So really key to know, it's not just sort of attacking the human, because that's very standard. Sort of the social engineering attacks continue to evolve, but it's also attackers using techniques like HTML smuggling, like the obfuscation attacks, in order to target the technical layer and the AI layer as well. And the last key point to talk about in terms of top tactics that are working for criminals currently is around the use of those compromised accounts and legitimate platforms. We talked quite a bit about what we mean by compromised accounts, but what we are seeing a quite sharp increase in is the use of legitimate platforms. And quite often we almost started to call this impersonation 2.0 from the attacker's point of view, by how prevalent and how successful they're being. So we're seeing a 69% increase in attacks sent from legitimate platforms over the last year. That's a huge increase year on year. And I'll be honest, no one is safe from this. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of legitimate services being used. All of the popular names you can imagine, some are on screen, but also quite some sort of smaller niche platforms as well. And this makes perfect sense from a criminal perspective if we put ourselves in their shoes very briefly, because these platforms are essentially trusted, they're legitimate, they're trusted by the technology, but they're also trusted by people. If an attacker can send something from a platform that a staff member is familiar in using, psychologically, that is a credibility statement for the attacker. The other key thing to note from an attacker's point of view is it's not just free to send services. As we know with phishing attacks, the hottest commodity out of it is gaining users' credentials. And as such, when an attacker gains credentials, they can automatically see if a user has accounts for some of these other services. And then not only will they use that user to send out emails from that compromised account and all of the other nefarious activities post-compromise, the attacker will also use it as an asset for these other legitimate platform services. So it's both the use of legitimate platforms from a sender point of view, a free-to-use point of view, and any exploits for those platforms, but it's also using compromised platform usage as well. And just to share where this has kind of come from over the last couple of years, which is quite useful, we see that it's been here for quite a while. Sort of 2022 really was the first year we saw it get above sort of 1 or 2% usage. But then in 2024, it's exploded and continued to increase in 2025. And it has reached the threshold, unfortunately, like a lot of these attacks, where it's been successful enough that this attack vector is here to stay. So it's a key consideration and a key takeaway for you when evaluating this data. Is my advice to you would be look at what platforms you use internally and match that from a threat landscape point of view to those most impersonated and most used legitimate domains by the attacker. Ensure your staff are aware that just because it's coming from these legitimate platforms, in no way does it make it safe or benign for your end users. And really see where policy can play a part as well based on your organization's individual missions and roles. The last thing to call out on the sort of legitimate platform usage is how diverse and rapidly changing the criminal ecosystem is with it. Quite often we see that actually the most impersonated domains remain quite consistent. However, with the exploitation of these platforms, almost every month, the whole of the top 10 list changes, and it changes quite rapidly, which is quite an interesting / frustrating area to handle, where attackers are moving through these different platforms so quickly. So it's important we always keep our eyes up on what the next potential platforms to be exploited are. And in conclusion, around these use of legitimate platforms, we've seen a big shift from attackers just trying to impersonate the platforms to them using the platforms itself. They do say it's the perfect form of impersonation is just being real and using the actual platform itself. They are leveraging them because they are so highly trusted, both from a technical point of view. They're on a lot of organizations' allow lists to ensure business continuity and the fact that we don't want to block some of these key assets. And quite often, they are involved in some of the more sophisticated attacks. So for those more targeted attacks, for those more attacks which are more on the niche scale rather than those bulk campaigns, that's where we're seeing a lot of these attacks come through. And just finally, just an example for you, it fits into almost any phishing template-based attack. You can replace this brand with any of the others. It still invokes all of the traditional phishing building blocks of the social engineering, of essentially, in this example, it's using pay as the lever to inspire that greed and curiosity from the employee to click that accept invitation. The added stress and pressure on that employee, though, is they may use that platform itself. So key things to keep in mind for how things are evolving. But keep in mind, we also evolve in the same way in how we train our employees, how we update and enforce our policies, and what technology we're using to help catch these attacks as well. The other big part I'd like to talk about is sort of what are we seeing almost post-email delivery? What are attackers trying to do and how are they lengthening their attack and kill chains by actually going for more multi-channel attacks? And when I talk about multi-channel attacks, quite often it starts with email still, but then through that email, they attempt to move you to either your phone through things like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Slack, or Zoom or Teams. We've even seen quite a few examples of email attacks trying to essentially go into physical security incidents. So it's definitely one to be aware of, the fact that this is on the rise over the last, especially 6 months. We've seen this quite heavily. But it's also the case where the traditional security principles still apply here. Email is still the point of contact for the vast majority of these attacks. The secondary part of that is through individuals' telephone numbers, especially those that have been in data breaches. So if looking at how much of a threat is this for your organization specifically, doing some open source intelligence studies can help give you more visibility. But in essence, we are seeing this across all phishing attacks, especially with a rise in payloadless attacks, where the initial email attacks core mission is to move you to some of these other sources. And we've seen a huge rise in phishing attacks. That is sort of telephone attacks, and so much so actually where we're seeing attackers utilizing AIs to talk back to the employees. Historically, phishing's been quite easy to catch from a human point of view, because if you stop talking for a couple of seconds, the robotic voice will come out and just talk over you. However, linking that up to some of the LLM technology, what we're seeing is real conversations. And you'll see in a report where a lot of my teams have actually had conversations with these criminals' AIs. And a key thing to note, because I know a lot of people are divided by this, especially those of us in security. Unfortunately, these technologies that are utilizing deepfake technology, this is as bad as the technology is ever going to be now. And even over the last 2-3 years, we've seen how far deepfake technology has come, both in the image and video generation, but also through the voice recognition. And that technology, combined with these LLM and conversational bots, is allowing attackers to essentially resurrect old attack vectors far more successfully. So phishing in combination with the rise in multi-channel attacks is one to be aware of. And when we talk about phishing, just to sort of give an idea of how prevalent it is, we're seeing it in still quite a small number of attacks. And of those attacks, again, majority are not that sophisticated. However, looking forward, especially into 2026, we are seeing these more advanced AI-driven phishing attacks are becoming more prevalent. So much so that actually this year, despite the small base number, we've seen a 449% increase in phishing. So if that trend continues into 2026, that's suddenly one of the most prevalent attacks. It will be up there as a standard attack vector, along with things like link-based attacks, payloadless attacks, and attachment attacks. So one to keep an eye on and one to be aware of and be proactive of with our organizations. Now, I touched on there a little bit about how attackers are using AI. And I know it's become a great buzzword for industry, but we're kind of moving forward past AI as just a buzzword to actually some practical considerations on both the defensive side, where we're utilizing AI in some great effect, and as we should be. However, attackers are doing the same and making the most of a lot of these tools that are available. Now, just to share a bit of a framework, really, because I know it can be difficult, and I know my team's faced this as well, where working in security, overnight it feels like we now need to be experts in new fields to help protect our organizations. But really, going back to security principle sort of basics when considering the impact of AI, really it comes down to two vertices. Understanding the breadth of how AI is changing attacks. What I mean by that is things like, is it just allowing an attacker to send out 100 attacks in the same time they could have sent out one attack before? But how is it also adding depth to their attacks? What new capabilities is it unlocking for the attacker before? is that unlocking attack vectors or TTPs, which were previously only held to the elite category or nation states, are now being propagated to your average hacker group or script kiddie or any of the other actors against our organizations. So really just a couple of examples of this just to share, and I recommend taking this away and evaluating any threats against your organization to see and understand. So the easiest example and best example to be aware of for how AI is changing the breadth of attacks is around AI and personalization. Historically, targeted attacks, spear phishing attacks were incredibly rare. You're talking a couple of percent going back 5-10 years, because it was time consuming to create the research to find out about an individual and organization, then curating a phishing attack from that, creating a payload to use in that phishing attack, and finally delivering it and trying to get past the security boundary. That's a lot of effort, so the target would have to be worth it. However, what we're seeing with everything from OSINT-led large language models, which allow attackers to automate a lot of the OSINT capabilities, combined with LLMs being able to generate on the fly and adapt known phishing templates, is essentially more and more attacks are becoming personalized to a user, or especially per organization. And that, combined with the polymorphic attacks we talked about briefly earlier, is leading to almost a tailored attack in every attack. And this is one thing that we've seen over the years, is the average campaign size of successful phishing campaigns has been dropping and dropping and dropping. And it was only at the beginning of this year where the average phishing campaign is now smaller than the average email campaign, which is a really interesting dynamic from the attacker's point of view. But that's sort of the breadth. And you're like, okay, so what we're doing should still work against a lot of these breadth attacks. We just might need to tighten things up because the average sophistication might be rising, but our security principles still remain. Our technology, as long as it's performing well, will still perform well against more volume. Our policy and training is just as applicable. But where it does change slightly is where we're seeing attackers gaining new tools through the use of AI. This is where they're adding depth to their attacks. So the prime example of this, especially in sort of the cloud email security space, but also in the social engineering space in whole, is deepfakes. And we're seeing deepfakes being used really across the board, everything from fake Zoom meetings, but more commonly through audio clips, through video, through images, in order to create credibility. And this technology is evolving. I know the team have created a deepfake version of Jack Chapman, and apparently this deepfake video promised everyone pay rises, for example. And that was within sort of just a couple of clips online, and it was quite believable. So the key thing to consider here is, okay, the attackers have gained new capability. What do we need to know from the defensive side? The prime example, and a lot of people sometimes go over the top when considering this, is one of the oldest rules of security policy is, before making a financial transfer, ring the person and validate it over the phone, not just over email. Well, with deepfakes, that's something at risk. However, good news, we don't have to throw everything out. We can just evolve forward together. Rather than changing it from make sure you talk to the person over the phone, just evolve the policy to talk to the person over the phone on the recognized number for that organization and have safeguards around that number. So there's a lot of things we can do to help combat this through technology, policy, and through our people as well. I realize I covered quite a lot very quickly today. I really appreciate coming on this journey with me, and hopefully I've highlighted a couple of key parts from the report, which I hopefully you'll all enjoy and get a lot of value from. But I'd like to share a couple of closing thoughts really from what I've seen in prior years, but also really looking to the future as well. And I've really got 6 key things to take you through. It goes without saying threats will continue to evolve. And the key thing here is that they're becoming more personalized per organization. So it's really important to take what people like myself are sharing with you, but then consider how it impacts your organization the most. The second key part is we're still in the infancy of AI and the evolution towards more intelligence-driven software. And we're already seeing AI being a major target. And it's not just attackers targeting sort of machine learning systems, but we're seeing so much agentic AI coming through. It's really important we secure our AIs as well. Quite often in industry, we talk about security of AI. We talk about AI for security, but we also need to look at securing our AIs. How do we train our AIs, our agents, to be as robust as another layer in our organization? And also consider it from the point of view of what is the future workforce going to be looking like in 2026, 27, of we're going into this world where it's people plus AIs, people plus technology even further than ever before. So when we're looking at securing those, really we need an end-to-end approach to ensure nothing falls through the gap. And that's where I've got 3 top tips on top of those predictions. First and foremost is utilize smart technology. We talked a lot about how the threat trends have changed and how attackers are using a lot of this AI technology. There's a lot of technology available that we can use on the side of good and the defensive side to help combat it directly. So definitely evaluate technology stack end to end across all of your core delivery pillars and really make sure that it is up to standard. The second key point is be proactive in enabling the workforce of the future and looking at sort of the AI mission, because we're seeing a lot of it in shadow IT. I know, unfortunately, quite a lot of organizations are struggling to move forward to that AI adaptive and AI first model. Unfortunately, this is one that is going to get away from us in security unless we are proactive. So host those discussions with the leaders in your organization about how are we protecting these toolings, because it's not just protecting another server box, it's not just protecting another network. We're empowering these technologies for business benefit, but with great power comes great responsibility. As such, we need to ensure that that is secure. And the last point, and this is quite an important one, is historically, quite often when we look at security, we view it in nice boxes. We have lots of nice boxes, be it humans, technology, policy, looking at sort of different 7 layers of security. But attackers are sort of breaking those down and looking at multi-channel attacks that are targeting both technology and people. So when evaluating our defenses, we need to do the same. And the core reason for that is ensuring that by dividing things to disparate boxes, quite often things fall through the gaps. And if attackers are viewing attack chains and kill chains as more holistic in nature, we need to be doing the same to ensure our organizations are as secure as possible. So that's been my very brief preview of our Threat Trends Report. There's a lot of amazing content in there. I recommend downloading it, and it is available in the resources of this talk, along with a lot of other interesting elements. All of the data we've seen and sort of harvest are from our own platform data. So if you'd like to know more about how we're detecting a lot of the attacks we talked about today and how we're helping customers in both the cloud email security space, but also broader afield in that holistic approach through our human risk management approach, please come book a demo. We'd love to show you really how we're helping organizations and defeating these emerging threats. Really appreciate your time today. Any questions about the report, please reach out. Thank you very much.